Welcome to Commander Central, episode 339, and today we'll be talking about older commanders and older archetypes that have improved through new cards and might be worth a second look. I'm Dana.
I'm Max.
I'm Chris.
And I'm Seeb.
Seeb, welcome to the show, bud. How's it going?
That's good. Thank you for having me. I've been following you guys for a long time. Figured might as well contribute and get to talk to you over the podcast.
We've got to hang out in person multiple times over the years, but this is the first time we've had you on as a guest. So thanks a lot for joining us, and thanks for supporting the show.
I guess you can call me a groupie.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
He is the first patron.
Oh, really?
One of the first.
Patrons. Okay.
Probably top first five.
You've also been around the community kind of for a while because you've gotten mentioned on Brainstorm Brewery quite a bit in the past. I know you've given Jason beers or had beers with Jason before too. So you've just been around.
I actually have beer at my house for Jason right now. So
well, there you go.
You could just send that to me and not him.
Well, I'm going to be in Michigan in a few weekends and meet up with him. So you're kind of out of the way from Illinois to Michigan.
That's fair.
Well, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit to the listeners who maybe haven't been as lucky as us to have gotten to know you in person a little bit. When did you start playing Magic?
I started playing right before Chronicles came out. Ice Age, Fallen Empires, and 4th edition were all readily available. So I'm pretty old in Magic Standards, I guess.
Well, so when did you get sucked into Commander?
Commander was a little different. I played in the beginning, stopped, played a little while in college, got my butt kicked all the time in tournaments by kids that had readily available income. As a poor college kid,
sure.
I kind of gave up on it for a while. Theros actually rolled around, and I fixed a friend's computer. And his thank you to me was a box of a Theros Fat Pack or bundle, what you call it nowadays, for the younger kids. And I yelled at him saying, "You just gave me crack." And
one crack, please.
Exactly. A few weeks later, I was talking to my friends, like, "Oh yeah, we play every Sunday night in my friend's garage." I went over there, and it was Commander. And since then, I've been sucked into it and spent way too much money and time. So
that's a very familiar story. So, because we did a deck tech on you years ago, I think it was your Nebuchadnezzar deck. Is that right?
No, it was what's the one with the counters? The Angel. It was an Enchantress deck. It was...
Oh, okay. Yeah. I'm forgetting which... Because it's not even a deck you have together anymore, right?
Oh, no. I was telling Max I'm very ADD with my decks. If a deck lasts more than 3 months, it's surprising to me. I have one deck that's over a year old.
That's... Yeah, so really, you're not joking. You really lose interest very quickly.
Yes. Even that, I like decks, but there's, constantly new stuff doing the exact same thing, so I want to see how the newer decks play out.
I mean, yeah, we always joke about just the rate of product nowadays, but yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's if you are somebody who likes to brew or who wants to constantly update to something that maybe does a better version of what you're already doing, I mean, it's just relentless. It's just nonstop for the most part.
And I also hit the point where if I build a deck and it plays out exactly how I want it or a lot worse than how I want it, it kind of is a calling card for me to take it apart too. So it's...
Sure. Get that totally. Well, I'm not just... I want to say this to you on a personal note. Having gotten to play with you multiple times, we played, I think the first time was in Madison, I believe, or was it Milwaukee? One of those two events. I think it was Madison. And then we've played together at there was the first Magic Fest in Chicago. We got to get a couple games in there. And then last winter, we had a Commander Central event in Chicago that you put together and played multiple games. You've always been a ton of fun to play with. You're always just generally a good guy. I want to say on a personal level, I appreciate having you in this community and having you be somebody that has supported us and interacted with the show. You're seriously, that's worth noting. You're genuinely a great person to have around. So thank you very much for that.
Well, thank you. I'd have to say you guys have maintained the top podcast for me to listen to continuously. And part of that is because of meeting you guys in person and the social aspect that we've established with each other. So I appreciate it. It's very likewise.
Hey, thanks a lot, man. So this year, briefly before we move on to this main topic, we have joked about said the sheer crazy amount of product. Is there anything that's really jumped out at you this year that you've liked a lot? That's been your favorite thing that we've gotten so far in 2022?
I've liked backgrounds. I've built a
backgrounds are so
couple of
good.
them, and they're just very enjoyable. And I've been trying to brew kind of like, I think it was Joey did all background type thing, and I've been looking at that. But the backgrounds just have changed so much, and I even was looking at decks just because of the background, or old decks to rebuild because of backgrounds. So
it feels a bit like it's the successful implementation of, I think, what they were trying to do with the original partner pairs, where with those partner pairs, I think the problem was probably that they made them too kind of generic. So they lent themselves to just wanting to min-max something, where I think the backgrounds, particularly in the command zone, for the most part, they're forcing you to be a little more specific with what you use them for, because it's not a creature there. There's also maybe a little less power involved in having those there. But I do think it feels very much like what they wanted to do with the partner pairs, where you could take this one background and put it with one commander and it works one way, and it feels a little bit different if you pair it with something else. And I think that was a really slick design, and I've been really happy with it so far, both in the command zone and just in the 99. So yeah, no, I'm completely with you there. In general, I'm just a big fan of Baldur's Gate. I think that was a really great set. Although I've been pretty impressed with the Warhammer decks too. But I mean, yeah, I'm absolutely with you there. And we only have 3 or 4 more sets coming in the next couple weeks, so maybe we'll have a new favorite. Who knows?
Well, I'm very excited about Brothers War. I've actually read most of the books when I started playing. I actually have the Brothers War Talrand book next to me right now, so I'm very excited. My gaming name has always been a form of Gix, so as soon as they reveal that card, I will be building it, even if he is horrible as a commander.
Gix is one of the characters I'm most excited for too, so yeah, I'm completely with you there. Well, hey, if you out there in listener land want to reach out to us and tell us what you're most pumped for this year, or what you've most liked from sets this year, how'd you go about doing that, Chris?
You can find us on a multitude of social media platforms. You can find us on Twitter at CMDR Central. You can search us up on Facebook, CMDR Central. You can find us on YouTube by searching CMDR Central, and you can also find us online at cmdrcentral.com.
You can also head over to patreon.com/CMDR Central and check out our reward tiers, such as joining our community to play virtual EDH with everybody.
Well, thank you to all the patron supporters and all the listeners, and people like you, Steve, for helping keep the lights on all these years. We really do appreciate it. And again, thanks for finally joining the show and coming on and being part of this. Like I said, you've been a great member of the community. So let's jump into this here a little bit. So there's a couple of things that kind of prompted this show topic. So I'm gonna monologue here for a minute. So a couple weeks ago on Twitter, I don't even remember what the impetus was for me looking the stat up, but I looked up my Asperia Sphinx tribal deck, because I remember way back in the day when I first built that deck, I had a Petra Sphinx in the deck, which is a mono-white Sphinx from Legends that doesn't even have flying. And the reason I was running Petra Sphinx in that deck was there just weren't very many Sphinx options, but I couldn't remember how many there were. So I looked it up, and there were 19 legal Sphinxes at the time when I built that deck, because I built it, and then literally 2 weeks later was when Windreader Sphinx got released, which was, I want to say M14, might have been M13, whenever I built the deck. And then 3 months later, Theros came out, and that's when I got Metamai the Ageless. And then, since then, we've gotten a ton of good Sphinxes, including one that could be a mono blue Sphinx commander, if that is what you want to do. But at the time, it was super limited. So that deck has radically changed in the 7 or 8 years since then, just because it accidentally added a ton of Sphinxes. So that was kind of in the back of my mind about, decks that have changed. I don't want to linger too much on tribal specifically, because that's kind of easy to talk about. They're constantly adding new creatures that just might be useful for your tribe. They constantly add things in colors that might help out. If you wanted to play Golgari Elves, Reese Exile was really your only option. And then the last couple of years, we've gotten Abomination of Llanowar and Lathral Blade of Elves, and just a bunch of things that make playing black-green elves instead of, white-green or mono-green elves way easier. So, they just accidentally do that, or intentionally sometimes in the case of Golgari Elves. That was a theme from the set it was in. So, that's something that changes. You just get good tribal cards. Mechanically, you just get things sometimes. Kind of prepping for this a little bit, I went back and looked at some of the creatures that were in the first version of my Glissa Death Touch deck. Again, that was roughly 2013, I want to say. But in that first version of that deck, I had Kessig Recluse, which was just a spider with Death Touch, and Thrill Kill Assassin, which is just a 2/1 with Death Touch, because there were so few Death Touch creatures at the time that, there was a handful of good things. There was your Grave Titans of the world and your Harvester of Souls, which are still in the deck, but the things that I was running to have Death Touch bodies back then compared to what I'm having to run now, there's just so many options. So just, again, accidentally, they've released a bunch of cards that make a lot of things better. My Silumgar deck, I first tried to build that right after Silumgar was released, and I was using a bunch of things like Conspiracy to give other creatures dragon types, because when the deck was released, or when Silumgar was first released, there were 16 dragons you could run in that deck, including such all-stars as Clockwork Dragon, and Tika's Dragon, and Lotus Guardian, that none of you guys know what they do, because they're so very bad.
Tika's
Clockwork
is from
Dragon.
Mirage, right? That's the
Yes.
artifact one?
Yeah. Yeah.
Clockwork Dragon comes in with 4+1/+1 counters on it, and you can pay a mana to do something with them, right?
I think, if it takes damage, you remove counters from it, and if you can tap it to add counters, I believe. I specifically remember Lotus Dragon is a 4/4, I think it's 7 mana for a 4/4 that can tap for a mana of any color. So it's overexpensive Birds of Paradise. So yeah, again, and we've just gotten enough Black-Blue Dragons just accidentally with one release here or there that deck is much easier to play with dragons than it was at the time. But I don't know how helpful that is. I wanted to talk about it briefly, but I don't know how helpful that is to most players out there or people listening. Specifically, what I think is much more interesting is archetypes or commanders that are asking you to do a pretty specific thing that once upon a time was much more difficult to do, and today is much easier to do. And I don't know how often people revisit those things. And the example that popped up to me to kind of start this part of the conversation off was Kemba Ka Regent is a relatively old commander at this point. It's probably almost 10 years old. How Kemba works is you make a 2/2 cat creature token during your upkeep for every equipment attached to Kemba. Kemba was the first mono white deck I built, again, many, many years ago. And at the time, you were kind of in a position where you had to make a choice. Did you want to run a bunch of good equipment, swords, for example, and put them on Kemba, and then, also make a bunch of cats as a result of that? And then as soon as somebody board wipes, you have to spend 20 mana to reattach those swords? Or do you want to run a bunch of just absolute garbage equipment that's basically in sets to be in limited environments that you can attach for 0 or 1 mana, so you can cast them, attach them to Kemba very cheaply, go wide with those cats, and then if there's a board wipe, it's easy to reattach them. You were kind of in a position where you had to make a choice there. And it was a little frustrating at the time when I built the deck. I didn't keep it together very long because I found that putting a bunch of garbage equipment on Kemba wasn't that fun. And putting a bunch of good equipment seemed much more fun, but it wasn't when the first person that would cast Wrath of God, and you're basically screwed then because it would take so much mana to reattach that stuff. But that was, 7 years ago. Today, there's a bunch of things that accidentally have been put in the game that work around that problem, whether it's Arden that lets you re-equip stuff, or Sigarda's Aid that lets you do it, or Halvar God of Battle. There's a bunch of things that let you kind of work around that reattach your equipment for a gazillion mana problem. In addition, if you are going wide, there's a bunch of things that exist in the game that didn't exist back then that make it easier for those cats to be impactful. So there's, in the last, month alone, we got Starlit Spectacular from the unset that's actually legal in regular Commander. That's kind of a fixed-ish Cathar's Crusade. We got For the Emperor, which is from the Warhammer 40k decks, which just gives all your creatures +2/+2 and Vigilance and the lifelink. So it's kind of like White's version of an overrun if you're going wide with those cats. Anyway, the point is that Kemba deck, the way I built it in 2015, would look way different today in 2022 and would play way more effectively. But I've never thought about rebuilding Kemba. It just never occurred to me. It didn't work back then, so I've kind of mentally abandon it, but that deck would play way better today than it once would. So anyway, that's kind of what we're talking about here. I want to talk about commanders and or archetypes that you guys think are going to play way better today and are maybe worth a revisit because the game has changed and there's been a lot of cards added to the game that are going to make things work better. So I've been talking here forever. I'll start with asking Max this. Is there anything that jumps out at you, Max, that like when you're thinking about this topic that you pops up in your head as this plays way better than it once did because we've added cards in the game just kind of accidentally over the years?
Yeah, one of the first, I guess, more archetypes or strategies that came to my mind was Defender.
Oh, yeah, sure.
For the longest time, people like running Doran because, it's big butt tribal, but a lot of stuff that has big butts are defenders, and those can't attack. So I think one of the first cards that we got a while ago was Assault Formation that lets you, creatures without defender can attack this turn for a single green, you deal damage equal to your toughness. But then we got Arcades the Strategist in M19, which is just Assault Formation on a body, essentially, and a draw engine. But I've been looking, but we've now gotten tons of stuff with either Defender or deals with Defender, such as the mythic green creature from Jumpstart, where it enters the battlefield. Talrand Titan, there we go. It enters the battlefield where with X 1/1 counters on it, where X is the total toughness of all creatures you control, and you can sacrifice a creature with Defender, and all your creatures gain trample. I think Defender is one of those mechanics that we get in kind of every set because it's evergreen, I think.
Yeah.
So we're always going to get a couple bodies here or there. It's just kind of what colors you're looking for to play in. And I just think over the course of time, we've gotten a lot more cool creatures that are either have Defender or are 110s or 112s,
No, that never even occurred to me as one of these ones to talk about. Because that's a real good point. Not only do we get Arcades, we've gotten other versions of Assault Formation. We've gotten things that like let creatures deal their toughness, deal damage as part of their toughness when they swing in, which isn't specifically designed to make Defender better, but like it works really good in those kind of decks. They also kind of brew walls differently than they once did, where like oftentimes wall was, or the things with Defender were just kind of afterthought creatures. Hey, this thing is a, 2/3 with Defender or whatever. Nowadays, if they're actually going to bother putting a Defender thing in a set or a wall in a set, it's usually the design is much more intentional. It's like, it's still wall, but like there's usually something a little more clever about it, whether it's Crashing Drawbridge where you can tap to give all your stuff haste. Like that's just a really useful thing to have in, particularly if you're playing that Arcades deck where you don't have a lot of haste in those colors. That's the kind of thing you see with Defender nowadays that maybe you didn't once see.
And like Dominaria United, we got Shield Wall Sentinel, which is essentially a 1/3 that lets you tutor another creature with Defender out of your deck.
Yeah.
Like that's huge right there.
Yeah, no, that's super cool. That's a good one. I wasn't even thinking of that. Yeah, I like that one a lot. Chris, any of these that jump out at you?
Not really. I sat and thought about this really hard when you brought this up, and the way I do decks is I put it together and I really don't think about it afterwards. Like, oh, I could rebuild this deck because it's good now, and I don't ever think about that. I'm just like, nope, that deck sucked. Never building it again.
I mean, I do the same thing where like this, thinking about this topic has made me think about these decks in the past a little bit, but like, no, I have not considered rebuilding Kemba until I got thinking about it. And then I realized all the stuff that was there for that deck. So no, I get that. See, any of these that kind of pop up for you?
I was looking at discard themed decks because there's been a lot of good stuff added lately. Like I built Rafine and I really like it, but like the two big cards for that are like Containment Construct and Currency. Is it Converter? I believe.
Yeah, I believe so.
But something like that where it plays with the newer decks, but you also there's tons of old cards that would discard. You look at Latula, Keldon Overseer, where you're discarding cards to deal damage. Or you're looking even at like Volrath the Fallen, you're discarding stuff. A lot of the times you're worried it's just dead in the graveyard with those older decks, but they're adding more stuff or even Bone Miser where you're getting effects from discarding things. There's a lot of newer cards that make the self-discard even better, which I usually hate discarding my own cards. I hate when I draw too many cards and I have to discard. It's probably the worst part of my game is trying to decide what to discard. And it's a little easier now when I can make use of the cards I'm getting rid of.
Well, even things like Turgid, where like you're getting not as powerful as discard is for other people, as Maska discard is. In that deck where you're like being able to take the stuff they discard is ridiculous. So that adds a whole nother layer to that as well.
To that aspect, I do have the reputation of being a mean person to play against. I don't go that far. I won't play Turgid against people, so let's not put me in that category there.
No, now we need to talk about this. You open the door. We're going to talk about this. My very first game ever with Seb, he busts out Narset. The Narset that we all Chris hates us for killing him for. And how'd you win that game? Didn't you just go infinite on me with turn Seb? Or you Jocko hops?
Let's back up a little bit here. Okay. When I started playing my very first ever Magic Fest, or Grand Prix is what it's called, I was naive. My first deck ever built was Boros Gisela. I sat down with someone with a Sliver Queen, and turn 3 got Hermit Druid into Lab Maniac. And it was, wow, I just got stomped on. So I admittedly went to Narset and built my own pub stomp for a little bit. I played it against you. I played it one other Magic Fest in Indianapolis or Grand Prix, and I pub stomped people, and I realized, wow, this isn't fun. This is, especially for them. So I migrated away from that. Like, I look at cards even like Zakama. I would love to play that, but is that a fun commander to play against other people where you control the entire board? No. So I have learned my lesson, Max. I've learned.
You have. You
can teach an old dog new tricks.
And I will give you credit, too. By the time at least I first played against you, you were always already very good about being like, hey, this is a very powerful deck, just a heads up. You were always already very good at like giving tables heads up about that.
I am known among my groups as a very high synergy, well, not to pat myself on the back, but I like to think I build decks accordingly. So, but I love synergy. Synergy is a thing. So when you see, once again, like the discarding of things, I love that I can discard to lead to something else.
Sure. Well, so another example I'm going to mention here, and this is a deck that I didn't take apart, but I will talk about because it has changed a lot over the years as well. So I still have my Talrand Sky Summoner deck together, and it's still a ton of fun to play. When I built it initially, and I know I've told the story here before, but I'll briefly tell it again. At the time, we had a guy in the shop who I didn't like very much. I think he was kind of a jerk. And he played almost exclusively red decks. He had a mono red deck, and he hated blue decks, and he hated counterspells. So I put together a Talrand deck with 25 counterspells just to play when I was stuck in a pot against him. Because I didn't like the guy that much that I intentionally wanted to have a deck that he hated if I got stuck playing against him. At some point then he quit playing in the shop, so I had this Talrand deck that wasn't something I wanted to play against anybody else, but it was together. So I was like, well, what could I then do with it if I'm not just going to have it as a troll deck? So I yanked out, 3/4 of the counterspells and just put in a bunch of cantrips and found that balance and figured out how to make it into a token deck. And I've had it since then. It's super fun to play. It's not crazy control-y. It's just me casting, brainstorms and ponders importance and making as many drakes as I can to swarm people. When I first converted that deck over, though, it was tricky to get enough drakes to reliably kill people. I mean, yeah, they all have evasion and stuff, but like killing 3 people with 2/2s takes a while to do. And there were things that I had in the deck. Yeah, I might hit a gravitational shift or something, and hey, that makes a big difference. It makes it easier to do lethal damage, but there's one of those, and there's not a lot of ways in mono blues to tutor it up. So the deck was fun to play, but it wasn't maybe as effective as I would have liked it to be. Since then, however, since I've put it together, we've gotten things like Heraldic Banner, which is a mana rock, but it buffs creatures of the color I choose. So like I basically could swap out some mana rock I was running and put in Heraldic Banner. And yeah, it costs 3 mana versus costs 2 mana, but it also turns me swinging with 4 drakes for 8 damage into me swinging for 4 drakes for 12 damage. Like that adds up. That made a big difference. Strixhaven Stadium, same thing. It's a mana rock, so it didn't really take up a slot, but it occasionally just kills people. Throne of the God Pharaoh, same thing. Deals damage at the end of the turn to your opponents based on the amount of tapped creatures. So if I swing and hit somebody for 6 creatures or 7 creatures or something, well, I'm dealing that much damage at the end of the turn. It just adds a good amount of damage to the table. That wasn't a card that existed then. Curiosity Crafter, Murmuring Mystic, and Whispering Wizard specifically are 3 I have in that deck that all do Talrand things. When you cast a non-creature spell or an instant or sorcery or something, they will make you a token with flying. They're not drakes, but like, who cares? They're still evasive flyers that interact with the Heraldic Banner and the gravitational shifts and the favorable winds of the world. So like it's just ways to duplicate my Talrand effect and get that many more creatures to go wide. Candlekeep Inspiration, since we talked about Baldur's Gate before, is a spell that changes the base toughness, power and toughness of a creature to the amount of instants and sorceries in your graveyard and in exile. So like, I think every time I've cast Candlekeep Inspiration, the worst thing it's ever done is make my Drakes into 8/8s. So it kills people. Like it's just a card that like in that deck, when I draw it, I almost always just kill everyone. None of those cards were in the deck or existed when I built it, but like they've significantly changed how effective that Talrand deck is. And I would say a lot of that stuff also applies to if you're just looking to build something with like small blue flyers. A lot of those cards probably work. Many years ago, I looked at building a Una Queen of the Fae Fairy Tribal deck because I thought it would be cool. I had a Bitter Blossom from something. I had an Una. I've always liked playing Dimir decks, so I was like, oh, I should try to build a fairy deck. That would be cool. And every time, I never actually even put it together because every time I would like try to rough the deck out in Architect or something, I'd get to the point where I'm like, okay, how do I win? It's going to have the same problem as my Talrand deck. But in the last year or so, I've got a friend I was teaching how to play Magic, and we went over some possibilities of things she could build, and she settled on Blue-Black Fairy. She wanted to try that. So I'm like, oh, okay, well, let me revisit this deck. And in re-looking at it again, I saw, well, a ton of the stuff that made my Talrand deck better also works for that Blue-Black Fairies deck, the Heraldic Banner and Strixhaven Stadium, and the Throne of the God Pharaoh, and the Candlekeep Inspiration. I mean, just accidentally again, like, it's one thing in my Talrand deck where I've got a gazillion instants and sorceries, but even in a fairy deck where even if you only have like 3 or 4 in your graveyard, that's still a pretty big buff if all your creatures are 1/1s. Haunted One, talking about backgrounds, is one that, gives your creatures +2/+0 if your commander becomes tapped and if they share a type with it. So in this deck where it's all fairies, when you swing with your commander, it buffs all the rest of your creatures. Feywild Visitor, another background. Whenever a creature you control, a non-token creature you control deals damage to an opponent, you make a fairy dragon token. So like, again, it's going to make you fairies in a way that you didn't have access to before. They're also fairy dragons, so that works in my Silumgar deck. But so anyway, there's an archetype. If you're playing like something that has small flyers in blue or blue-black or probably even blue-white, there's a bunch of things that we've gotten in the last few years that make it way easier to poke through. I remember a lot of this stuff probably applies to Merfolk. I had a buddy years ago who had a white-blue Merfolk deck, and that was always his problem. It was really tough to win. It wasn't like there were that many Merfolk tokens even, so it was kind of tough to go wide in blue-white. A lot of the stuff that like applies to that Talrand deck and applies to that Una deck probably also works pretty well in that Merfolk deck in white-blue. So again, there's just quite a few of these things that I think are worth looking back on if you might have once decided to not try them, because when they add a gazillion cards every year, there's just going to be things that make decks work better. So are there any ones that jumped out, any other ones, Max, for you that jumped out here?
Yeah, I think Forced Combat is another maybe archetype or strategy that
Dana's
has gotten a lot of help.
I mean, it kind of didn't even exist, really. That's even like as an archetype, that's almost a relatively new archetype for the most part.
Right.
Are we talking about like goad or something like that?
Exactly, Chris.
Okay.
So like the commander I always remember that kind of had that was Bassandra, the Boros Angel that you can pay red and target creature attacks this turn if able. And then Conspiracy comes along, or Conspiracy 2, I think, and we get this mechanic called goad, which is really cool. And I just love that we've seen more and more goad stuff make its way through even a couple standard sets or a modern set, or even in these pre-con commander decks we get with every set. We have ways to incorporate maybe not so great mechanics for standard, but into a standard type product because the new set just dropped. I'm going to go buy the EDH deck. And I think the fact that we're getting goad in colors that aren't just red is really neat as well.
Yeah, that's right. That is a thing. It's also a mechanic too that's useful just outside of Forced Combat decks. Like some of those spells are good just in general. Like even if your whole deck isn't built around Forced Combat, just a little bit of that is good for breaking up board states and stuff. So it's not a parasitic mechanic at all. It's just good in general.
I also like it because it makes kind of breaks up the stall in the game. Like if you are on a time crunch, goad helps that game get done in that hour or 90 minutes that you might only have tonight.
Disrupt Decorum was fantastic for that. I loved that card when it was, because that's really the first one that goaded stuff like that. Yeah, great for like just breaking up like locked board states for sure. Yeah, no, that's a good one. Well, that makes me think a little bit too of like when I built my Brian Stroudarm deck, I had a bunch of kind of act on impulse effects. I'm not sure what the first one was, where like you take a creature temporarily and then give it back to the end of turn. My plan with Brian was to, use the 3 or 4 of those mechanics that existed and fling their creatures back at them with Brian. Almost every set, though, we've since like every time I took the deck apart years ago, but very consistently, whenever we get a new set, we'll get a new version of that. So like if there's treasures in a set, we'll see the red version of that makes you a treasure. And if like scry is the mechanic for the set, we'll see that with scry or something. So like, at the time I only had a couple of those effects. Today, there's a bunch of them. Like if you were looking to run things with like the temporary theft thing too, there's just a lot more of those for you to choose from than there once was. So yeah, talk about mechanics and stuff. There's that kind of thing has really broadened itself as well. Any more for you, Seed, that jump out?
Blink and ETB, kind of a combination.
Yeah.
Right? It's,
Yes.
Like when you look in the beginning, there's Rune, and then, no offense to Max, there's Brago. I've built Brago. When in doubt, I've probably built most decks because of my ADD. I built Rune. The problem with Bant and Azorius is, what's my win con, right, Dana?
Right, exactly.
It's
correct.
It goes to even what you were saying, win cons. They've improved win cons so much. So you were tied into those colors really for Blink. Now you have so much more things. I think like Terror of the Peaks, I've built Livio kind of deck that has stuff coming into ETB to hit people. You can do more than just control with Blink decks now. I think that was a big change with, you're adding Ephemerate, you're adding, Conjurer's Closet's old, but Teleportation Circle, you're adding Thassa, you're giving more colors the availability to blink stuff, and that just opens up so much more ETB with like Panharmonicon, so you can deal damage instead of just control people. I think that's really changed a lot for that archetype.
What weirdly enough, what I've kind of noticed too, is it's kind of made those decks a little bit less of a slog to play against too, because years ago their win condition was kind of to outvalue you or find some infinite loop combo, but you had a lot of those decks where like they were just trying to like, loop a thing or even if they weren't looping it, just like generate so much value that eventually they would have too many things for you to deal with. But that was a slog to go through too sometimes.
Watch me play with myself.
Right. That's gotten better, I think, because there's so many more alternatives now that it's easier to win games in a way that doesn't involve you just like taking a bunch of time generating a ton of value. So even for your opponents, I think that's having those more win con options. I think even playing against that deck, I appreciate them having ways to win that weren't there once upon a time, because it's just less time you have to watch that person fiddle around with stuff. So yeah, Chris.
Yes,
I know
sir.
you didn't have any. I know you didn't have any ideas, but has this conversation sparked anything in your head about things that you would revisit or look at again? Decks that you've taken apart that you think might be a little bit better these days?
The only thing that ever keeps popping in my head is tribal decks because of the amount of tribal stuff that keeps coming in, and it's ridiculous because it's like every set you get something new to use. So other than that, not really.
Well, the one downside with that, and I will. So I hear what you're saying, because that's definitely something that someone has a couple tribal decks. The one problem that winds up happening is almost every time there's a new card that's like good for your tribe, maybe not in zombies, but in other tribes especially, they're legendary. Like you can very easily, in my Silumgar Dragons deck, like 10 of those creatures are legends. At this point, my Isperia deck is like half legends. The half of those Sphinxes in that deck are legendary. Even in my Glissa Death Touch deck, I'm closing in on like half of those creatures that are legends, just because a lot of times the good creatures are legendary. I've seen people with Angel tribal decks be like, I've got my angel, my 3-color band Angel deck, and 17 of my 24 angels are legends, which is a thing that can sometimes, I guess, maybe be a problem. But that is an interesting thing that I have seen with tribal decks too, where when there's so much of this stuff and they're printing so much for commanders, because WotC tends to make legendary creatures good as your commander, they're also good at 99. So like, I think there is an element of that where tribal decks have absolutely gotten way better and there's a lot more support for them. But there's also, you also then sometimes wind up in a situation where half your creatures are legends, which is just kind of funny sometimes.
Yes.
Don't forget about tribal decks. Maskwood Nexus, Arcane Adaptation.
Yeah.
What's
Orvar, the all form as a commander for those kind of decks. Yeah. Well, or even things like goofy things like you see, you know, people can play a all shrine deck now. Like there's enough shrines out there, or there's so many gates now that like people are, you know, Maze's End decks are way easier to build even with Golos gone. There's a bunch of different ways you can build a Maze's End deck because there's so many of those gates that exist that weren't there as a thing years ago. So like if you tried that Maze's End deck and you're like, it didn't work well enough. Well, it might work well enough now. Yeah, there's just, it's easy to like get a little bit frustrated at this sheer amount of stuff that comes out. But man, it has opened up, I think, a lot of stuff for people to build decks in ways that just didn't exist before. I mean, how many different commanders that can run a Super Friends deck were there? I mean, there weren't a lot of, like every Super Friends deck I think I saw for the most part for a lot of years was like 5-color. People just ran like whatever good 5-color commander existed. And then Joda came out, so they all switched to Joda. Yep. But like it was just, there was really, since nothing interacted with Planeswalkers necessarily, people tended to just build 5 colors. Well, there's a bunch of different things that interact with Planeswalkers in different ways that can be your Planeswalker commander now that give you options that you didn't have when you wanted to build Super Friends stuff, even, 3 or 4 years ago. In addition to support cards for that, there's multiple support cards, things that interact. Again, at the time, it was basically the Chain Veil, and then maybe a few of the Oath cards that we got. And now there's multiple different things that, tutor up Planeswalkers or blink Planeswalkers or put counters on Planeswalkers, or there's a piece of equipment now that can be equipped to a Planeswalker.
Now they just got to give us more stuff to kill Planeswalkers.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't disagree with that either. I think they need to open, which I think they've been slowly doing. But yeah, they need to open that space up a little bit more as well. Although I will say this, I feel like I probably, weirdly enough, see less Planeswalkers now than I did even a couple of years back, because I think because they've printed so many, the novelty has worn off. I think there was a point in time where people were like, I'm going to put a Planeswalker in every deck because I got this one and it's cool. And I think now there's just so many that I think that's no longer a thing to a degree.
Well, a lot of decks that are out there, the Planeswalkers aren't even good for them, though. Like, you can't find a Planeswalker that fits that theme.
Honestly, that's when I see them now. Like, once upon a time, I would just see Planeswalkers a lot of times in decks because they were a useful value piece. Like, the Gurk Wildspeaker, untap 2 lands, that's always good.
Yep.
I don't see much of that anymore. Now I see, like, I'm playing an Angel deck, so I'm putting Sarah in the deck because Sarah's cool and she fits my Angel deck and it makes sense there, and I'm going to do that. So I see that's what I tend to see nowadays, I think, is more people do that kind of thing versus like run them as a value piece, which I think they were doing for a lot of years because they, had one and thought it was cool. So they put it in their deck. So
yeah, because it was always hard to get rid of a Planeswalker. So
yeah, for sure.
Or people are just learning in general that when a Planeswalker hits the battlefield, that you just become, primary target.
Well, because like Hero's Downfall was a big deal when that came out as a card because it hit Planeswalkers. At least in Commander it was.
Instant speed, yeah.
Yeah. So it was like a better murder, and murder was kind of a big deal at the time. So like there's a lot more things that do hit Planeswalkers, and I do think we need more. But yeah, that's changed a little bit too. I think it's been something that I've for sure noticed. I don't have many more, but like, are there any more from you, Max?
The only other one I could really think of is like X spells.
Sure.
I just kind of thought back to when I first started playing Commander. The X spells I saw were either Hydras or your draw spells or burn spells, and there was that Gruul creature that you can tap to add 4 colorless to spend on X spells. I have it, Roshin the Meanderer. There we go.
Oh, sure.
And then I think that was cool. And then in 2015 we got Mizzix of the Ismagnus, and in those decks you just saw the X spells because you had 9,000 experience counters and you could fireball the table to death. But Ikoria, we got Zaxara, which benefited you from playing X spells because you made more tokens equal to the value of X. And then in these 40k decks, we have the Ravenous ability that is giving you extra benefit for spending tons of mana, along with Magus Lucia Kane, which
she just kicked my butt too.
Because her ability is tap to add 2 colorless, and if the next spell you cast had an X in it, you copy the spell or ability.
Right.
But then there's also just tons of support outside of just those mana doublers that you used to see within X spell decks, and they're still there, but like there's Qualth Unrivaled Ancient. When, he attacks, add X mana of any 2-color combination to your mana pool equal to the amount of power of the attacking creatures you control. I like seeing the cool ways to make a lot of mana that aren't your Zendikar Resurgent or your Doubling Cube or your Vernal Bloom or something like that.
Yeah, no, that's a good one too. Well, and even I thought when you started talking with it, I thought you were talking about Spellslinger stuff, where like again, once upon a time you had Mizzix of the Ismagus, and that was really like the main option people would use. And there's a lot more stuff that interacts with casting instants and sorceries and Spellslinger type decks as well in a way that like wasn't really out there for a lot of years. And Mizzix didn't have the best reputation because it basically was something that went infinite really, really, really easily. But like, there's a lot of things. If you don't want to run that, there's a lot more options that once existed for sure. Any final ones from you here, Sieb?
Oh, I always have stuff. I was looking at damage doublers / increasers when you're looking at like
so
Fiery Emancipation, Angrath's Marauders, even something like the new card Geierson Starn. So it just really opens up things that are doing minimal damage. Torbrand too, so I always like doubling damage. Group Slug, it's a little different than Life Loss, so it doesn't help Chris as much, but there's definitely a lot of things that benefit off that.
What I like about those damage doubling kind of effects too is they stack in a way that like double strike stuff sometimes doesn't. And I guess we just recorded an EDH Recast episode this week that is not out yet, but I talk about the card Twinferno a little bit from Dominaria United that gives you an option to give a creature double strike or copy a spell. And one of the things I talk about that is what's nice about that card is you don't want to have too many double strike options in a deck. At least I don't. Because then you find yourself in a position where, like, if you have multiples in hand, they don't do you any good. Versus where it's like Twinferno, if if you're holding a Temur Battle Rage or your creature's wearing a Fire Shrieker or something, you can still use that Twinferno to copy a spell or something. It's not limited to just being a double strike option. That's what's nice about damage doublers. That's never a consideration. You don't care if you double your damage, just double it again. that's even better. As a matter of fact, you want multiples of those, kind of.
It's really made me want to build a deck. My friends built it a couple times, the Dong Zhao deck, where you make a creature deal damage to its owner. I just figure you could alpha strike people with their own creature by casting them at that point.
Oh, yeah.
There's a black legendary that does that too. I can't think of her name. It's like Aki or something like that. She's from Kamigawa, original Kamigawa. And it's something about you tap her with, I think it's like 2 mana to tap her or something, and target creature deals damage to itself equal to its power. So.
Oh, yeah. I know what you mean, though. Yes, Chris.
Or you play it with briefly. Like Repercussion, which is always a brutal card anyways.
Yeah. Yeah, those are, I mean, that's one of those things like those effects. The biggest problem with those is you never want to take one out. You just want to add a new one into your deck every time. Like Fiery Emancipation didn't replace Gratuitous Violence in any deck. It just went in alongside it.
Well, that's what I've been doing. I've been progressing from deck to deck, going what's best with this damage dealing effect. So I was playing the newest Hidetsu for a while, and I'm actually going to convert that into an Abaddon deck with a whole bunch of pingers and just see how much damage I can increase, then cascade into free stuff because I've dealt more damage.
Mm-hmm. Well, and one of the things they've gotten good at too in set design is kind of backdooring ways to give you stuff that like traditionally in the past, for example, if you were hoping to get artifact creatures for your artifact creature deck or something, you didn't really get those outside of like a Mirrodin block. That's not really true anymore. Like if you play an artifact creature deck, we just got a ton of stuff in those Warhammer decks because there were things that like Warhammer lore-wise made sense to make as artifact creatures, so they gave you artifact creatures. So that's a thing that pops up, I think, nowadays too, where like they are aware that if we're going to make this thing, and I'll go back to Feywild Visitor, the background from Baldur's Gate, that whenever you deal damage with a non-token creature, you make a fairy dragon creature token. That could have just been a fairy creature token, but there's really nothing game breaking about making it be a fairy dragon creature token. And as a result, like it doesn't make it any more powerful. It just makes it more useful in more decks. So if you're playing a fairy deck, well, suddenly that's a good card. And if you're playing like I am, a blue-black dragon deck, well, suddenly it's good in that deck as well. I think they've gotten much better over the years about making cards do double duty and be good in multiple different places versus like just one. not just like universally good in every deck, but they've had them be good in multiple more specific decks, if that makes sense. I've seen that with equipment in the past, where like I've seen a good piece of equipment, you're like, oh, that's good in an equipment deck, and it's good in this one weird specific deck that I have where the mechanic makes sense. Like Vorpal Sword. If you happen to be playing something that cares about equipment in black, Vorpal Sword's a perfectly useful card, but I've got it in 2 different decks that aren't equipment decks because it just happens to be good in those decks as well.
Well, that adds on to, for equipment, you're not tied to just Boros anymore either. They've added black, green, blue equipments that are really good, like Rogue of the Archmage, Vorpal Sword. There's so many more options too.
Yeah.
The one that comes to mind when I think about that is Wand of Orcus. The one where equipped creature attacks or blocks, it and zombies you control gain death touch, and when it deals combat damage to a player, create that many zombie tokens, 2/2s. You don't have to be playing zombies, but it's also going to build your board state up. It's quick. if you are going wide or you need to bodies to sacrifice, that's useful. If you happen to be playing equipment colors that have access to those, it's useful. If you're playing zombies, it's useful. You're not just going to blind jam that into any deck in those colors, but there's multiple different paths where that card is a good card. So yes, no, that's a perfect example of that. It's good in different situations without being like a Smothering Tithe card that's good in every deck that can run white. So I think, from a design perspective, they've gotten much more clever about a lot of that kind of stuff too.
You notice how a lot of these decks are referring to Dana's decks that have been around forever that just are getting better because of his deck building choice. We got Talrand, we even got Vela, Vela, it's a lot. Yeah.
Well, it's easy to think about in those terms too. Like talking about even Kemba was one I no longer have but had, or that the fairy deck was one I built for somebody else. So like it's that, I mean, looking at things from the perspective of things you've built is very. I was trying to do that for Max. I was like, would Max's Tajik deck be better with anything today? And that was one I couldn't think of, Max. I couldn't figure out what would change with your Tajik deck.
Just more equip cost decreasers. That's really, I guess. Put Arden in there and put.
Well, They have made both Boros and Mono White much better over the last few years, they are a lot more playable as well.
No, definitely. Like they've made a specific attempt to make Boros way better. I think they've been real successful in Red for sure, but Boros definitely they've tried to address a lot of those weaknesses for sure. So that again, that's just going to accidentally help a bunch of decks if you're just playing a Boros deck and you were hurting for draw. Even if nothing like specifically for whatever Boros thing you were doing has changed. Well, you've just gotten some, you've gotten the Jessica's Wills of the world and the Outpost Sieges and the cards like that just like give you more draw options and stuff in Boros colors. So, yeah. What I would suggest the listeners do is if there's a deck you abandoned 5 years ago because something didn't work in it, take a look back at that deck and see if like just because you haven't thought about it in 5 years doesn't mean that deck hasn't today's version of that deck wouldn't play in a way that like fixes what didn't work about it once upon a time. Because I think there's a lot of those out there, a lot of decks out there that have been fixed even if you're not aware they've been fixed. So any final thoughts from anybody? Feel free to just jump in here.
I'm good.
You're good. Seeb, you good?
I'm good.
Seeb, thanks for coming on, man. And thanks for supporting the show all these years. We really definitely do appreciate it.
Well, I plan on sticking around, so.
We'll make sure we get together. Like we keep expecting any day now them to announce the event schedule for next week or next year, not next week. So we'll definitely there'll certainly be something in the Midwest we can get together at and jam some more games.
That was my complaint, is I haven't seen anything locally. I thought maybe Q4 of this year they were, and there was nothing.
Yeah.
So I have been, I posted in our one Slack channel. I would gladly set up another game early next year for another weekend if people are up for it. So if you're wanting to go to Chicagoland area, look at that channel and let's get something going. I know we have a handful that would do it already. It was a great time, and I'd really enjoy doing that again.
That was a blast, for sure. Seeb, thanks for supporting the show, man. Thanks for coming on today. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Why don't you tell everyone quick in where they can find you if they want to say hey?
There's not really. I guess I am on Twitter.
Okay. What's your Twitter handle?
That's a good question. Max, do you remember my Twitter handle?
I'm on it. I'm looking right now.
I think it's just Seeb13.
It is. Seaburn13.
Seaburn13. There's only one Seaburn out there, people.
And you're the 13th
And
one.
you're the 13th one. You've also got 1 through 12. It's like your troll accounts.
Well, if you look at, I have Seaburn at Yahoo, Seaburn at Hotmail. Once again, showing my age on me referencing those 2 emails. So
Seaburn at Ask Jeeves.
Oh gosh, that's old.
Nettel.net.
Right. Yeah. All right, guys. Seaburn, thanks a lot for joining us today. We do appreciate it, man.
thank you for having me.
You can find me on Twitter at Dana Roach. You can find Max at CMDRCentral_Max. And you can find Chris at WiseSquishy1. Our show is edited by Rafael Garcia. You can find them on Twitter at Ursa Bearwalker. And our podcast theme is Retro Future Dirty by Kevin MacLeod, licensed via Creative Commons. We'll be back next week with a new show. Until then, I am Dana.
I'm Max.
I'm Chris.
And I'm Steve.